Welcome to our podcast today. It's lovely that you're joining us. My name is Roland and I'm with Dave this morning, and we wanted to discuss about Christian books. Why do we have them? Why should we read them? What can we get out of them? Hi Dave, how are you doing?
Hi Roland. Yeah, well, thank you. Good to be with you. Excited to be talking about one of my favourite subjects in the world.
Exciting. Why don't we ask the question, do we need to read, or do we need to read Christian books, just to kind of open up the topic?
Oh, well, it's a really good place to start because I think it's a question really worth asking. You know, should Christians read? Do we need to read? And of course, I'm interested to hear your view in a moment, but I think at one level, the answer is no, because Christianity is a relationship. It's about knowing a person. It's about knowing Jesus, knowing God, and you don't need a book to mediate that relationship, which is actually different to other religions, where there are religions like Judaism, which has the law, the Torah, like Mormonism, which has the Book of Mormon. Islam has the Quran, where the faith, if you like, the revelation, the primary revelation comes through a book. Whereas in Christianity, it comes through a person. It's about knowing someone and being loved by someone. First and foremost, the revelation of Christianity is personal, not through word, but through a person. So, and of course, for the first 1500 years, so 3/4 of Christian life, most Christians couldn't read, and often even the books that they had weren't in a language that they spoke themselves. So there's, for most of it's worth remembering, for most of the history of the church, people haven't read and haven't needed to read in order to know God truly. But having said that, we have the Bible. The only way we can know the God that we want to relate to is through the way he's revealed himself as recorded in Scripture. And there are lots of different Jesuses on offer now, aren't there? Jesus is quite kitsch. You could follow the Jesus of the Jesus Saves money box, or the Jesus that you have hanging from your rear view mirror, or any kinds of superstitious things. How do we know who Jesus is? Well, we know it through reading the Bible. And how do we know what the Bible means? Well, we have centuries worth of other books which help us understand what it all means. So long answer to your question, but I think it's a really good question. So I would say, no, you don't. Someone who can't read can still be a Christian, but if you can read, you can make life much easier and much more interesting for yourself if you read, and then they can help you to know God more fully and more truly.
Interesting. Kind of thinking about what you say there, almost that Christian books are a luxury, but a luxury worth having. In the sense, we have everything we need through the Bible, through the person we meet in Jesus, and we should never replace that. But they are the luxury that we have on top of that.
I would agree with that, except for the Bible, which I don't think the Bible is a luxury. I think the Bible is the only way that we can actually truly know who God is. Otherwise, we just make it up out of our own heads or imaginations. And actually, the Bible, I would say, that is the way we come to know God, because the Bible gives us, as it says at the beginning of Luke's Gospel, the way of being certain of what it is that we've been taught. We can go right back to Jesus and the eyewitness accounts of him.
So it's probably worth noting that today we're not talking about the Bible. We're talking about the centuries of books that have been published around the fact that we have the Bible, that we know Jesus through that scripture, and all of the ruminations.
And I would love to do another podcast on the Bible. That would be another whole thing. But yeah, today we're talking about other books.
Yeah, that would be definitely fun to do one specifically on the Bible. So have we answered that question? Why do we have Christian books? Do they have a particular purpose, or are there lots of purposes? Why do people write them? Do they keep themselves in a job?
Well, there is some of that possibly. But I think one of the reasons to read them is that we're not the first people who've ever tried to follow Jesus. I guess it's possible that these two guys called Roland and Dave are the first people to stumble across this person, Jesus, and think, oh, let's try following him. But we're not in that world. But I think if we were to never appeal to or research what other people who tried to follow Jesus before have made of it, we'd be probably quite arrogant, thinking, oh, we can do this on our own, and B, we would miss out on so much that other people have learned. You know, we're standing on the shoulders of the shoulders of the shoulders of the shoulders of giants, aren't we, as Christians? We've had 20 centuries of people who've gone before us, and books are probably the primary way that we access all of the learning that all these people who've gone before us, who are every bit as sophisticated and intelligent and all the rest of it as this generation is. You know, the greatest minds in the world have grappled with the question, what does it mean to follow Jesus? And people have been through every human experience as Jesus' disciples, and so much of that is available to us in books. So for me, that's one of the reasons that I love to read, because you can learn so much from people who've followed Jesus and done a much better job of it, you know, in whether it's in the first century or the 20th century. And how about you? What makes you read Christian books?
Well, I was just thinking while you were talking that kind of thinking back to the early centuries, that they had that scripture, they had that knowledge of the person of Jesus, and then they ruminated on it, and they sent letters to each other, and they told their friends, and one person wrote to another saying, this is what I'm thinking, and another went, yeah, but I'm thinking in a slightly different way, and there'd be these back and forth. So some of the early ones are essentially collections of letters, they're ruminations. You know, from scripture, we know the person of Jesus. Through our living out of that, we learn the implication of knowing Jesus in our life. And the reason I think why we have books in every generation is every generation has to work out the implication of what it means to have Jesus in your life. And you can't really work that out once and for all. Every generation has to work it out for themselves. There's no point in reading something that's 300 years old and assuming it will speak to you in exactly the same way. And that's why I think there is always a market for new books, and they may well be something that was written 100 years ago in a different way, but you have to work out the implication of what it means for you. And a new book that's newly published feels relevant. They're talking about the same stuff, but they are working about what it has meant for them.
So do you think that back in those earlier generations, it's been more of a community dimension, which is why people have written letters to each other and maybe read more books, and there's a sense of, well, I can't do this on my own, I need other people in order to work out what it means, whereas maybe now we think less like that? Or do we just do it in different ways?
I think we do it in different ways. Certainly, you know, the invention of the printing press changed everything on, you know, we wrote letters to each other because we could only write it once, or if we were really dedicated, we wrote it out 5 times, but even that probably felt like a big effort. So you had a lot more of the sort of dialoguing between communities, and also communities were closer together. There was communication across wider areas, but it wasn't the instantaneous that we assume now, that you can just pick up a book that was published and pick it up on Amazon and it will get delivered to you the next day. I think the scenarios around kind of lend themselves to the reasons why that happened. So some people say early bishops would, thinking of someone like Augustine, would write something and then send it out to all his churches. And that was often an early example.
Yeah. Pre-Amazon. It's a good reminder just how different our context is.
We were chatting recently about the Bible and how people all have their Bibles, but how it's interesting to remember how relatively recent, you know, a house Bible was. You know, historically, even in the printed press Bibles, there was one Bible in a church, and it was chained to the church. No, wasn't it known as the chain Bible or something? An absolutely huge tome that would be impossible to steal because it'd be too heavy anyway. But they'd have daily services, because no one had their own Bible at home, so they would come to church and hear it read on a regular occasion. And we just have an opportunity to not only have a home Bible, but all the resources we'd ever want, whether on a Kindle or in a printed form.
And we take for granted that we can have the Bible, or even, you know, probably in many cases, lots of Bibles under the same roof, when even today there are countries in the world where that is not, many places where that's not possible, or where it's even, you know, illegal, and in some countries. And I think we can forget the treasure, you know, how the coronation service for the Queen, or the British, you know, monarch, at one point they are, after the coronation, they're given a copy of the Bible, and it says, "This is the most precious thing this world affords." And I think we've lost that sense of just how precious it is to be able to read the Bible for ourselves. And it saddens me that reading the Bible, and indeed all Christian books, seems to be going out of fashion a bit at the moment. Certainly there are far fewer book sales now than there were 20 years ago in the Christian press. And I think it would be a great thing to, you know, I hope there'll be a revival in interest in what the faith actually means, and alongside all of the kind of new media, for people just to read again, and because there are so many amazing books out there.
Talking of that treasure, Dave, do you have a book from early on in your faith that you went, you know, this sparked things, and you were like, you know, I will always treasure that book?
Well, I do. And when you asked me to bring some books along, I found it really hard to choose one. But the one I bought this is the first book anyone ever gave me about a Christian faith. It's called Questions of Life. It's the book of the Alpha Course. And my friend Ross wrote to me inside it. He wrote, "Dave, I hope you enjoy this. Keep searching until you find what you're looking for. You won't be disappointed. Love, Ross." And so my friend Ross Wilson, who's now also a vicar, actually is in Northern Ireland. But when he wrote these words to me, we were both working for Unilever, a company in Southwest London. I wasn't a Christian, but I was really, really searching. And I had lots of questions about life. And so this book, Questions of Life, sets out the basis of the Christian faith. You know, who was Jesus? Why did he die? How can we have faith? How do we pray? How do we read the Bible? And my favorite chapter in it, I must have read this book so many times, but my favorite chapter is about God's guidance. And I have gone back to that and read it many, many times. And so in a sense, this book is where it started, as you can tell from that message in the front of it.
Yeah, that's really exciting.
How about you?
Yeah, well, for me, when I came to faith in my first year of university, and a friend of mine who brought me to faith, who lived on my corridor, gave me an album of Tim Hughes music and the book that he had written at the same sort of time. And it says it was written for worship leaders, but it was a really good introduction on why we worship, why it excites us, why worship is the most exciting thing that we can do. Yeah, and really sparked my, you know, love for Jesus, and just listening to that music. It's funny because I think that album and a Hillsong album. So I had two albums. It was before the world of Spotify. So I just, you know, on repeat had those two albums going for a good 6 months. And still very fondly think of them when I listen to that music, and when I kind of look back on that kind of foundation of why we worship, and why it's exciting, and why transformation happens through that.
So do you still know every word of every song on those two albums?
Yeah, quite probably.
I mean, I think I love that, but there's something about books and about albums, aren't there, that you just enter into the world of the music or the world of the book, and you're in this kind of private kingdom that is free and is it's I think that's why people love music. That's why people love books, is that they transport you somewhere else. And I think for me, that's one of the things that's so helpful for faith, because faith also transports you to somewhere else. You know, when we pray, we're entering the courts of heaven, we're with God, we're alone with him often, and we enter this place where everything's different, and we learn new things, we're inspired, we can cry, we can laugh, we can pour out our hearts, and I think books for me help me into that that place. And in the same way that we memorize the words of our favorite songs and albums, so, you know, Christians have always memorized, especially the Bible, but also other kind of words of enormous wisdom that have come down sort of through the church through the ages. And I think there's a lovely analogy there between those favorite albums and favorite books, and how, you know, you can keep reading your favorite passages or favorite books, just like you can keep listening to your favorite songs.
It's interesting kind of thinking back to those early memories, and they will always stick with us. If we were to sort of move more to the current day, the pandemic affects all parts of life, and unsurprisingly will affect people's reading. I imagine what was it, early March last year, some people went, oh, I'll have loads of time to read. And will probably have learned quite a lot about themselves. For you, has it made you read more or read less, read in different ways?
I think it's made me read a little bit more because I have had more time, and especially in the evenings. And I think it's made me read maybe a bit more widely. So yeah, and one thing that I think reading does is it feeds your imagination. And when we're kind of locked down, a bit like we were just thinking about being taken to another place, you know, I think that reading things that really feed your imagination help and inspire you. And actually, not just books. I'm really enjoying The Perfect Planet, the new David Attenborough thing. You know, it's so amazing. The world is such an amazing place. And, you know, I can either sit in the evening and watch the news and just endlessly hear about all of the awful things that are going on, or I can carve out some time to, you know, to be inspired by just those incredible images of, you know, I was watching last night how these little ants kind of survive at 60 degrees in the Sahara, and I'm just thinking, this world, it's so mind-blowingly amazing. And I think reading, you know, some of the things I've read in lockdown have had a similar thing, whether it's Christian books or non-Christian books, but trying to feed my imagination more during the pandemic. How about you? How's the pandemic changed your reading?
I mean, for me, at times, it's certainly made it harder. I think there have been points when you've wanted to make reading an escape. So there have been a few more Bill Bryson books than there might have been in an average year. Then when I realized I could never, in the next few years, travel to these places, I stopped reading them. But yeah, reading can often be an escape, can't it? I think we read for very different reasons. And there were certainly some parts of the pandemic when reading for investment didn't feel like what I was most into. But there have been a few books that I've read, certainly for kind of personal investment. But I came to a point a couple of months ago when I kind of went, you know what I need to do is just read a book where I fall in love with Jesus again. And we'll talk later about types of books, but I almost kind of came to a realization that that is a genre of itself. They're often very simple books. They're not wanting to do anything apart from get that one thing across, that you love Jesus more when you finish it than when you started it. So that took me quite a while in the pandemic to go through those ups and downs, but I think I'm more in that place now, which is a relatively good place to be in, I think.
And so would you say, if you're struggling in your faith, or if, you know, if you reach a really difficult point, is that kind of book one that you would turn to? Is that one of the things that helps you?
Absolutely. I think one thing is good is it doesn't require so much of you. They're not the technical books. I'm thinking of a kind of a favorite one I have, Francis Chan's Crazy Love. First time I read that was on a long distance train journey across India. It was a 28-hour journey from Delhi to Assam in the northeast corner of India. And what was quite funny, we had one copy and I think 8 people read it on that trip. Not on that one day, but I think at least 2 people read it on that one train journey. And what's quite nice is I don't read many books really in one sitting, but there is something nice about an easy readable book that just inspires you to love Jesus more than you did before.
Well, I think that's something we have in common. When I'm struggling in my faith, when I feel bored or I just kind of, like a bit listless, one of the things that I will do is just find or borrow a story of someone's life who really loves Jesus, and read about some of the amazing things that have happened. Because I think there is, to all intents and purposes, a limitless supply of those biographical stories, and they're so inspiring. So many people have led the most amazing lives, and that's something I find as well lifts me up out of a rut.
Biographies are an interesting one. What do you feel what draws you to it? Because it's someone else's experience. I think you can definitely read a biography and go, well, that's great for them. They live a very different life from me. Or
Yeah, well, I mean, I love reading. I find it so interesting to be on the inside of someone else's life. I mean, I've read since Christmas. I've read Ben Stokes's autobiography, the England cricketer, and Barack Obama's, autobiography of his first term as president. And so it's not just Christian autobiographies, but I think I do find it fascinating, just the realities of, what do you do as an England cricketer when you have breakfast and you're waiting for the match, or, I'm interested in those little things. But I think incredible lives, they still get up in the morning and have breakfast, and you can learn so much from just the way their habits. So I think that's, yeah, there's something for me that I just love learning about what life is like for some of these extraordinary people, and maybe try and pick up some of their habits and make them my own.
apologies there for a slightly glitchy internet connection. Apologies there. We're now going to think about biographies. So Dave was talking about biographies, books that have really impacted us. I thought I would bring along David Wilkerson's The Cross and the Switchblade, a great example of someone who lived a reasonably comfortable life and was encouraged to work in the ganglands of America, and really challenged his own faith and stepped out of his comfort zone. And it was in that place that he found God. So that's the biography I wanted to bring. Dave, you also brought one along too. What one did you bring along?
That is the most amazing book. I'm so pleased you've mentioned that one. Yeah, here's a book that I read in lockdown when I was struggling and feeling kind of a bit low on my faith. It's called God's Smuggler. It's written by a Dutch guy who's known as Brother Andrew, and he grew up in incredible poverty. Actually, in Holland, he became a soldier and lived a very kind of dissipated life of drinking, and was involved in some awful things in the army, saw some dreadful things, and reached out to God from a place of real kind of rock bottom, and then ended up leading the most extraordinary life where he would take Bibles into communist countries. This was in the days of the Iron Curtain. Took incredible risks to reach Christians in the kind of hidden underground church in the communist countries. And it's just the most incredible story of how God looked after him, answered prayers, provided for him, and encouraged this very fragile church through his kind of his work of taking tens of thousands of Bibles through. So it's a really exciting book to read. Helen's just read it as well and has loved it. So that would be one that has really given my faith a shot in the arm over the pandemic.
That is one of only 2 books I've read 5 times as well.
And in fact, Roland, we both came up with this one, didn't we? When we said which books, we both love that one.
Yeah. So that's pretty exciting. But both of those are examples of someone else's life who kind of goes, when you're like, a life with Jesus is exciting. And it doesn't mean I need to do an identical copy of their life, but a life of faith should be unique, should be a genuine life of faith.
I'm so passionate about that. I think that if I think that if anyone ever leaves church thinking this is all just a bit dull. We've just totally failed, and that person, however well intentioned, has totally missed the idea of what, you know, how knowing God himself can be dull or boring or become just mundane and ho hum. I mean, it does, but that's our fault, not God's, you know. And that actually there are things we can do, especially reading books like that remind us, oh my gosh, this is the adventure, this is the whole purpose of being alive.
Yeah. And the day-to-day can feel mundane, can't it? But you do have to rouse yourself out of it and remember that isn't the 100%.
Yeah. And the great thing about these kind of books is that we don't have to rouse ourselves. These people will rouse us if we can just bring ourselves to open the book and start reading, and then it yeah. So it's not kind of self-help. It's almost like I feel like it's like someone knocks on the door and comes in and says, I know you're struggling at the moment. Can I help? Let me share a few stories from my life. And that's where I think we can really draw on this great cloud of witnesses, as it says in Hebrews 11, that kind of surround us and cheer us on in our Christian walk, because it is very, very tough. Has never been tougher than this last year. What have you read, Roland, during the pandemic that has kind of...
During the pandemic, I read a book on Christian leadership for young leaders. So I read Simon Barrington's Leading the Millennial Way, which is not really for leaders in a Christian context. It's very much Christians leading out in the world, and that's its main focus, and focusing on younger leaders who aren't leading businesses that they've inherited from their parents and that they've stayed in all of their life and they've worked through. It's looking at being, I think the millennial experience is very different, and what is that within a Christian context, and how can you be genuine to the Christian faith and to the context that we're in, and so looking at really inspiring leaders who are faithfully living that out and faithfully working it out as well, because I think it's a developing thing. So really interesting to see what it is for them, but also then what might it be for me as well. And they do encourage it's for millennial leaders and those who have millennial leaders in their organizations as well. So it's not just for those people, but it's understanding, I think, that the world is changing, and that's not a bad thing. Yeah, I've got
I'd love to borrow it.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple of other books. So now we've been in the pandemic for quite a while. I've committed to reading 2 books on the pandemic. So God and the Pandemic by Tom Wright, and then John Lennox's Where is God in a Coronavirus World. They're both really small, about 60 to 100 pages. So they very accessible, but I thought, you know, I want to kind of know and understand and be able to articulate that a little bit more, because people are just going to ask anyone, oh, so you're a faith, why do you think this happened? And one comes from a theologian's point of view, Tom Wright, and then John Lennox is a mathematician and scientist, so he comes from a little bit of a different perspective.
Wow, those look fascinating.
How about for you, Dave?
Well, I've one book that I read quite early on in the pandemic was How to Pray by Pete Greig. Pete is someone who, as a teenager, scrawled a prayer on the wall of his church, which went viral and it ended up giving birth to the 24/7 prayer movement. So there are now people all around the world involved in that movement, which has, and between them, they've been praying continuously since 1999, I think. So over 20 years of non-stop prayer arising out of one, you know, frustrated and angry teenager scrawling a prayer on the wall of his church. Amazing story. And there are many brilliant books on prayer, but this is the best book I've ever read on prayer. It's the distillation of 20 years of kind of hard-earned wisdom. He's a brilliant writer. It talks about all different ways of praying, all the problems about why we struggle to pray, why it feels like prayer isn't being answered sometimes. All, you know, so much wisdom in this one book. So that is a keeper for me. I think that's a book I'm going to read again and again over the years.
And did it make you pray more?
Yeah, it did. It really changed the way I pray. It increased my appreciation of who it is I'm praying to, and also my expectation about what prayer can achieve. And so, yeah, I think it's really changed me. And
another this is the acid test, isn't it? That I wrote down in thinking about this. We can have information and we can have transformation, and a good book will bring around transformation and not just give us information.
Yeah. Well, there's one other book I want to mention which has done the same for me, but in a different way. This is a much bigger book. It's a history book, so it's quite a big read, by Tom Holland, who is a historian, not a Christian, but he's written this account of how Christianity has shaped the Western world. And it's a book about the fact that, a bit like goldfish don't really know what water is because they're just in it all the time. There's an analogy that will appeal to you, Roland, as a fish keeper, but you know, I mean, fish, they just take for granted that there is water. So as people who live in the Western world, we don't really appreciate how Christian our whole way of thinking is. And so Tom Holland originally researched the ancient Greeks and Romans, the classical world, and he started to be intrigued by how come in that world, if you were stronger than someone, you either made them a slave or chopped their head off, or worse. But in the Western world now, people feed the poor, they have hospitals, and there's a sense of actually the strong having to look after the weak and not just dominate and oppress them and abuse them. And he traces the whole, so it's a story of the history of Christianity, but it's also the history of Western thought. And it made me realize that the impact Jesus had on the world is far more profound, and especially on the Western world, far more profound than I'd realized. And actually, if it weren't, his argument is, if it weren't for Jesus and the church, we would still have gladiators in arenas, we would still have barbarism, we would still have crucifixion as a public form of punishment, and actually the cross in particular for him went from being a symbol of military might and the freedom to do whatever you wanted with people you conquered, to being a symbol worldwide of the power of weakness and the importance of serving those, the weak and the poor, rather than oppressing them. It's an incredible, it rewired my brain, that book. Yeah. And has had a massive impact on me.
That's exciting. As we sort of round up, I wanted to think just a little bit about formats of books. I'm a dyslexic, and I don't necessarily find all books the easiest to read. And just to sort of pointer out that books in their printed form aren't the only way of doing things. For those who have Kindles, if you like your magazine subscriptions, I've got a subscription to Sorted magazine, which just gives me short articles. And that might be the door to opening and reading something else. And I'm an avid audiobook fan as well. And there are certain books that I prefer in audio form or in Kindle form and in paper form. So I just wanted to put out a little thing towards the end that what we're talking about doesn't just have to be the printed book.
Yeah, no, I'm into that. And we're the first generation of Christians who can have this conversation. But I would add to that podcasts. One of my podcasts that I listen to every episode of is something called God Pod, which is it's about theology. And it's got some really clever people on it, but they basically sit down, drink tea, eat biscuits, and ask some of the most amazing questions and discuss them together. And it really helps me. It's not just it's for anyone who just wants to think about, has questions about faith. And the other thing I use a lot is YouTube. If you're watching this, you're probably watching it on YouTube. And I would say when we finished, go to the top, to the search bar, Google and search Francis Chan, who wrote that book that Roland mentioned on the train journey. He's an amazing communicator, and I listen to quite a lot of his stuff. There's, in 3 or 4 minutes, you can get some really inspiring messages. Tim Keller is another person who really thinks through faith, a brilliant communicator. There are so many great resources on YouTube that you can watch. And so Francis Chan, for example, you could get a lot of the message from Crazy Love just by spending half an hour clicking on some of his YouTube links. And, you know, so yeah, if you don't enjoy reading, or even if you can't read or you struggle to read, then that's another way of accessing the same stories, the same encouragement.
Yeah, and I think the advantage of using different formats is that there is something for different moods. You know, when you're doing the ironing, do you want something in your ears? And that's when you can actually zone out of everything in life and do that. But you couldn't do that with a book. Or do you have to sit in your favorite chair and say, I'm not doing anything for another hour, I'm giving an hour to it. But it's finding the thing that's right for you and right for that moment, I think, and investing.
And bringing God into the moment. You know, who knew doing the ironing could be a moment where you actually really feel close to God? Or driving the car. You know, I do quite a lot of driving on my own in the car, and I can have some amazing times when I would otherwise just be staring at the tarmac or thinking, you know, depressing thoughts. Instead, I can sometimes emerge from a car journey feeling really inspired and excited about, you know, about my faith. So all of this has come out of books.
Yeah.
What a blessing to have so many people who've thought so deeply about their faith and made it accessible to us.
So Dave, as we close this podcast, do you have a sort of closing thought to encourage us to read more or to be spurred on?
I think I would say, imagine that the books or podcasts or, you know, YouTube clips or audiobooks, imagine there's a group of people just waiting to meet you who are some of the most incredible Christians that have ever lived, and they just want a one-to-one with you. And when you open the book or click on the podcast, you are getting to hear what makes them tick, and there's an endless supply of encouragement for you in your faith just outside the door. And all you have to do is open it, you know, open the cover of the book, open the, you know, your browser up, and you can access it. And however low you're feeling, or however, you know, disillusioned with faith, they are there to help.
Well, thanks for the chat today. It is always good fun to chat, and hopefully this has been inspiring for you. Maybe if you've been inspired, you could write down in the chat maybe something that you're gonna to read. Do get in contact with us if you want some recommendations. We're always happy to make recommendations and to help people and to inspire them to invest in their faith. And we think Christian books are so worthwhile. Everything you input, you will get back in your faith. It is not time wasted, but it is time invested. And we hope through this pandemic and well beyond the pandemic, you'll be able to find something that you'll be able to invest into. So thank you for joining our podcast today, and we hope to see you soon.